apart from your time, and of course that is important, but apart from your time, there's no reason you can't just apply for roles and even go through the interview process. You'll learn a lot from going through that experience. I would also say, certainly seek out feedback from, people like myself or others who've, gone through this transition. Get feedback on your resume, get feedback on your portfolio, get feedback on how you communicate, because I think one of the biggest things I see
to the FreeCodeCamp podcast. I'm Quincy Larson, teacher and founder of freeCodeCamp.org. Each week, we're bringing you insight from developers, founders, and ambitious people in tech. This week, we're talking with Meg Risdal. She's a data scientist and product manager at Kaggle, and she works closely with the data science community. Meg, welcome.
Hey, Quincy. Thanks for having me on. I'm super excited to be here.
Yeah, we're super excited to have you here. You're somebody whom I've talked with for years. You and I have been corresponding about open data sets and just machine learning education and different topics like that, because you're really at the vanguard working over at Google/Kaggle and just helping the data science community, the machine learning community. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what Kaggle is for people who've never heard of it.
Yeah, for sure. So for those who haven't heard of Kaggle, most people do know of us as a machine learning competitions platform. So that's kind of been our bread and butter. It's kind of the soul of Kaggle is the competitions that bring together our community of over 18 million registered users. So people are coming together to participate in one of over 50 or so competitions that we now host every year to learn from, kind of hands-on experience on, real world data sets that our hosts bring us against, really interesting, challenging problems that, hosts are seeing and experiencing. And it's a great place for people to kind of, learn in this kind of collaborative setting, but also contribute back to the, the ecosystem, the world, knowledge about what actually works well in machine learning and what doesn't work well. It's a lot of open sharing, despite the fact that it's this competitive, leaderboard driven platform. And then apart from competitions, we also have a lot of machine learning resources in our model hub, our datasets hub. And so that's something that we provide to the community, but our community is really what contributes the open source and open data sets and models, the ones from freeCodeCamp, for example. And people are using those in competitions, of course, but they're also using them for their own projects, whether that's for learning or, maybe even in kind of production use cases sometimes. And then we also lastly provide a notebooks platform where all of this kind of comes together and people can actually, do this work on Kaggle's platform. We provide free resources, including GPU, TPU, and CPU, of course, compute. So that's Kaggle.
Yeah. And when you talk about this notebook platform, is it kind of like Google Collaboratory, but more customized for the needs of the Kaggle community?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a lot like Colab with a couple of unique differences. So it's, of course, very well integrated with the rest of our platform. And one of the things that we care a lot about is reproducibility and making it really easy for people to get started. So we pre-install a lot of different common data science and machine learning libraries in our Docker images. So you don't need to the first thing you learn is how to deal with, Python dependencies. That's not the greatest experience. So we take care of that. And then we, make it easy to also pull in data sets from the platform, competitions, models, et cetera. And then the second thing that kind of is a little bit special compared to Colab would be the community sharing aspect. So you can publicly share notebooks that you've created with the community for feedback, kudos, and we even have a progression system. So you may have heard of like becoming a Kaggle competitions grandmaster. You can also become a notebooks grandmaster if you write really good notebooks.
Yeah, I've seen many CVs that have Kaggle grandmaster on them. Not like a ton, but I see it, and it's eye-catching because it reminds me of like chess grandmaster. Like, it's hard to achieve that level of, I guess, status within the machine learning community, but you can do it if you spend enough time like learning and building on Kaggle.
Yeah, that's right. It's like really become a credential in the industry. Like people, not only put it on their resumes, but we also see it in job listings. Like if you have experience participating, doing well in competitions, or it's a lot like having an open source portfolio or just like a portfolio you share publicly. It's another way of doing that. And so wanting to look for contributions back to the community, something we see in job listings too, which is cool.
Awesome. Well, before we talk more about Kaggle, and I'm really excited to like learn lessons because you've worked at Stack Overflow and you've worked at Kaggle, and before that you were in academia, and I want to drill into that too. Mm-hmm. But really, I'm like interested in just like learning about where you came from and like how you got into this field, because I mean it's like a very specific thing. Like when you were a kid, were you like, I want to be a product manager at a data science platform? Probably not, because I don't know if product management existed, and I don't know if data science existed when you were a kid. What did you want to do when you were a kid?
Oh, that's funny. Easy answer. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a pizza delivery driver. That was like it was like the most exciting moment when the pizza would get delivered. I was like, I want to make people happy like that. But no, when I grew up a little bit more, what's funny is I originally wanted to be a musician, which I don't know if maybe you didn't expect to hear that, but I totally, when I was in high school, and I went to the first college I went to as a music conservatory, I was like, I am going to become a professional musician. I studied music performance. I played oboe. I was in marching band. I was in pit orchestra. Like my whole life was like music. But then, I realized kind of like how tenuous, a career in music can be, because I, got a repetitive stress injury, and then very quickly realized like I maybe shouldn't hinge my entire career on, something that depends on my fingers bending a certain way easily or something. I don't know. And so I did a lot of kind of soul searching when I was, a little too young. I felt like 19, about what I wanted to do, and took a lot of different, classes. I was at a liberal arts college, so I took philosophy and sociology and all of these things. And I think, it really drew me towards the humanities and social sciences in a lot of ways. And I ended up getting my undergraduate degree in psychology, but I had also added on a minor in French. And what really, interested me towards the end of my undergraduate degree was a couple of things that are still, I think, maybe in some ways kind of common threads in my background. The first is, kind of from the psychology side, I got really interested in how people can be different. Various ways of like looking at personality and just behavior, and realizing, it's really a lot more interesting to look at the ways that like people can be different from each other and what that really means. And then second, in the language side, I was just mind blown that you could study language, that there was sort of like the scientific inquiry into how do people learn language, how does language change over time, things kind of like along those lines, and kind of then marrying that with psychology. How do people use language to do things like convey their identity, because they are different, and language is a really effective way for communicating to people. Like, the ways that I want to be different, the ways I don't want to be different, things along those lines. So I ended up getting a master's degree in sociolinguistics, which is like the perfect combination of those two things. So that took me to North Carolina State University, did a master's there, and the program was I chose that program because it was very quantitatively driven. They had a lot of courses on the R programming language, and they had a lot of courses on research methods and statistics. And I was, again, really interested in like this, the scientific inquiry of language and measuring differences, comparing differences, and looking at differences that way. Got a master's, and then I went and did a PhD at UCLA. I shouldn't say I did a PhD, I started a PhD. I actually ended up leaving after 1 year to go into industry.
Yeah.
That's I'll pause there because that was like my academic background. Eventually I did find my way to Kaggle. But that's kind of where I got really interested in people and data, and you can maybe start to see the glimmer of like why I'm interested in something like Kaggle now.
Most definitely. Yeah. I should say that like it's much more common for a freeCodeCamp guest to have left a PhD program than to have completed it, because there's so much work to be done out in industry. And, I don't know if I should even ask what made you decide to leave academia. I mean, UCLA, like it had to be pretty challenging to get. You were in a linguistics program there. What were you studying for your graduate work? That had to be pretty hard to get into.
Continuation. I don't want to. It was a very good program. I had every intention of staying in academia. It was kind of like my kind of trajectory in music, right? Like I was very convinced like I'm going to become a full professor, tenure, going to do research, and this is going to be my life. But I got to UCLA, and then I saw sort of like the reality in kind of like very stark way of what a career in academia looks like. In particular, seeing that, the pathway to becoming a tenured professor is like, talk about it's hard to get into UCLA PhD program. It's a lot harder to find your way into that, one single, like it's just the job market is ridiculous. You also don't have a lot of freedom over where you live and kind of, the direction that your life takes you. So I saw a lot of people graduate and then kind of move to, no offense to Canada, but, very like remote, places of Canada to do postdoc work or just other, essentially like, there's nothing else that brings you to this part of the world except for this academic job. And I had, at this point lived in Wisconsin, I lived in North Carolina, I lived in California. I also, spent a little bit of time in Michigan. I lived in France. Like I felt I had already kind of lived a number of different places and didn't, necessarily, I wanted a little bit more control over that kind of thing. Meanwhile, I felt that, the kind of thing that I was researching and interested in is something that I thought was very personally super cool. Like I was like, this is like, I love that I'm getting paid to look at how nasal vowels change over time in dialects of English. Like that's so awesome that I get to do that. But then, I kind of took a step outside myself and realized like, there's actually not a lot of people in the world who are interested in that, like shock. And I saw, the opportunity in industry to do something that was not just important to me, but important to a lot of people in the world. And so, I, of course, think academic pursuit is important and we need people kind of focused on pushing boundaries in these like little niche areas. But for me personally, it felt like I personally felt like I could have a lot more impact and fun doing something that would kind of influence and touch the lives of more people.
Yeah. I mean, like studying, changes in dialects over time. nasal consonants, or nasal. I guess nasal consonants are kind of also vowels a little bit, depending on like the, yeah. That does sound extremely specific. That's a very specific thing.
Right.
And what academia forces you to do is specialize. Like, oh, she's the English nasal consonant person, right? Like she's the expert, the world expert in this extremely specific thing. And maybe you're not even the world expert. Maybe there are like 5 or 10 other peers who've also been studying this, who have conflicting theories. And then there's the, Risdalian school of like talking about this thing, but so it wasn't that you weren't that interested in the subject matter. It was just the lifestyle of academia and the fact that, frankly, academia is a giant pyramid, and you have to do like your, postdocs, and you got to play this big game so you can become like, you got to work as an adjunct, probably. Like plenty of people who have PhDs from UCLA are working as adjuncts right now, right? It's probably really intense to get up to like a tenured position, and you probably have to do your time teaching in really small, liberal arts colleges in the middle of America and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Am I? Is that off
Again,
base?
I'm going to be offending everybody.
like a lot of my friends who left academia have said that. Yeah.
I think I've certainly heard it a lot, and I am really interested in. I'll say during the pandemic, I had a number of people who were in academia, mostly linguistics, reach out to me and ask me about, my career trajectory and how I made this decision, how I transitioned into tech. And so I would say like it's something a lot of people like experience. Like my experience is not unique, and I've been really happy to be able to share, what I've learned and what I've taken away from that experience with people who are going through it themselves.
Yeah, well, let's say, like, I'm just going to ask you point blank. If somebody is in academia right now, they're working on a PhD program, and they are definitely getting the vibe that, like, I want out. And I want to be very clear. I have a great appreciation for expertise, and we do need people to get PhDs and to continue to push forward the state of science, right? But at the same time, I could totally understand people not wanting to be kind of the sacrificial lamb who has to have like all this hardship so that science can be advanced. And like at the same time, you could take those skills and you can go work in tech and like probably have a much more immediate and substantial impact on a whole lot of people, like you are doing through the data science community, than you are on the linguistic, community in terms of researching, changes in dialects over time, right? So what advice would you give to somebody who is thinking, like eyeing the exit of a PhD program that they've worked so hard to get into, and they've already committed a lot of time, and they've got the sunk cost fallacy, they've got all this stuff. If they wanted to try to get into tech, what would be your advice to them?
Yeah. So one story that I often tell when I'm having this conversation with people making this consideration is when I myself was in the PhD program making this decision, what I did was I just threw my resume out there. Like I just applied for tech jobs. I applied for startups, I applied for internships, and I actually applied to Google, funnily enough. I just wanted to see, like, do I have a resume right now that can get me a job in tech? And what I found out was, yes, I got an interview at Google. Got an interview at Google for like a linguist role working on ontologies. And I didn't actually pass the interview. That was interesting because it was, they were looking for somebody with more background in semantics. That happened to be the only thing I haven't studied. So it's kind of funny. But what that told me is like, hey, I've got some signal that I have a resume that's like, probably gonna, find some success in the industry. Like if I got a phone screen at Google at the time, maybe that means I can land, my first data science gig. And so that was what gave me personally the confidence that I could make it out there essentially. And so that was the big moment for me. And I honestly recommend, doing, trying that out, like there's really no, apart from your time, and of course that is important, but apart from your time, there's no reason you can't just apply for roles and even go through the interview process. You'll learn a lot from going through that experience. I would also say, certainly seek out feedback from, people like myself or others who've, gone through this transition. Get feedback on your resume, get feedback on your portfolio, get feedback on how you communicate, because I think one of the biggest things I see from folks who kind of are going through this transition from academia to tech is just the communication styles are pretty different. So emails I get from academics are like very long-winded and can take a while to sort of get to the point. It's just a stylistic thing. Whereas in tech, it's a lot more informal and a lot more kind of like, to the point. At least, and this is speaking, about tech in like U.S., Canada that I'm kind of coming from. But that's just a couple things. There's a lot of other things I'd be happy to dive into too.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Maybe you could talk about so you're at UCLA, you're doing this program, you start casting out your resume, you start getting interviews. What was the process like of getting a job at Kaggle? And keep in mind, I'm not trying to glean any information that people would use to try to get a job specifically at Kaggle. I'm just trying to understand your perspective. So you don't have to reveal they asked this interview question and this interview question. I can see all the people that are job seeking taking notes and stuff. We're not trying to do that. We're just trying to get a general feel for what that process was like and what that experience was like.
Yeah, for sure. And what's interesting is when I interviewed at Kaggle, it was before we were acquired. So now our interview process is just Google. So none of this will be, relevant to any kind of current hiring process, specifically at Kaggle right now. But yeah, so when I applied at Kaggle, I'll maybe just back up a little bit because when I applied to Kaggle, I was already out of my PhD. I was working in my very first job out of academia. I was working as a data scientist at a boutique market research firm in Pittsburgh. So I did move again. And what was interesting is I was the only data scientist at this firm, and I was their first data scientist. And so I'm clueless. I'm kind of approaching projects in sort of this very academic way, telling my stakeholders about p-values and things like that. And they're like, what the hell is a p-value? I had just, kind of felt like I need to find other people who are data scientists. So I actually joined Kaggle as a community member, initially with the intention of, just finding a community and finding other people like me and maybe even, competing in competitions to just learn and do everything that brings people to Kaggle, of course. So that was the plan. What actually happened is I got a newsletter in my inbox that from Kaggle that said that they were hiring for a content marketing kind of temp. And I was like, yeah, that actually sounds like a really great way to, actually, learn more about data science is by actually, I'll just apply for this job. It's like a 10-hour contract, 10-hour per week kind of contract thing. So I think it was one of those, submit your resume and an email explaining why you want to do this job. I would love to I know I still have the email. I'd love to go back and read it again. But, I think I, said exactly the kind of things I've described here. I am, a data scientist. I'm really looking to get closer to, field of machine learning, and Kaggle's the best way to do that. And I've already started creating stuff on Kaggle. Take a look at some of the things I've created. So that was my email and my resume. And then it was enough to spark their interest. So they reached out and just did kind of probably imagine a phone screen style of, interview. This was for just a contract role. So it wasn't sort of the heavyweight full-time interview process. But I did that. And then they asked me to do a project, kind of a small project. So the role would have been doing things like managing Kaggle social on our blog and interviewing community members and creating technical content, and also writing copy for the website, specifically for our competition. So the project was to actually write some copy for a hypothetical competition. And so I did that.
So that was like the interview process. The interview process was
Yeah.
doing something that was very similar to what you would actually be doing on the job, which is great. I wish more interview processes were like that instead of, doing a bunch of leak code problems.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
really cool though.
I do have a funny story about when I converted to full-time though. This was, like I said, I think I started in, early 2016, this contract role. And several months go by, and Kaggle had recently, started to work on this new thing called datasets. So our datasets platform at the time was super nascent, and I got really interested in how do we make the datasets platform successful. So a lot of the stuff that I worked on in my kind of part-time capacity was elevating what we can do with datasets, kind of learning how people in the community want to use datasets, and taking that and informing the direction we wanted to head with the product. And so I was pretty proactive, and it was really driven from a point of passion for what Kaggle was doing. And they saw that, and they were interested in extending a full-time job to me to continue working, on the team, which I was super excited about. But I did have to go through more interviews, and I know I met with a number of people interviewing, even though a lot of them were already kind of familiar with my work. I think they were fairly, I honestly can't really remember the interviews except for the one, which is a funny story, which is they wanted to, it was like a SQL interview. It was like an actual coding interview. The person that I interviewed with, I'm now actually really close friends with. But the problem was I didn't know any SQL at all. And so the interview was me just kind of saying, I could do all of this in R, no problem, and here's how I would do it, but I have no idea. I've never learned SQL at the time. So, I was obviously still extended an offer, and now I'm one of the SQL experts on the team at Kaggle. At the time, I actually, I think I flunked that interview. So I just got really lucky that they still let me in.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, that's great that they saw, I guess, potential in you, she can learn R, so she can probably learn SQL. She just hasn't learned it yet, right? And it does sound like you didn't have a traditional data science background, and that you didn't get a computer science undergrad and then or study stats and applied mathematics or something. You probably learned a lot of the math just incidentally, because when you work in any field of science, you have to learn a lot of math, and you probably have to learn some basic programming, statistical packages like R. I don't know if R is a statistical package or it's a language, but it's got it's a language with a specific purpose for doing, data analysis, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So, that's pretty awesome that they took a chance on you. My first job out of grad school was similar. I was the youngest school director in the entire school system, and this lady, very nice lady who was my boss, interviewed me. She kept calling me back to interview again and again because she's like, I'm not sure about this guy. He doesn't have enough managerial experience, or he doesn't have any managerial experience, and he's going to be managing 25 people and all this stuff, right? And so I went back and interviewed with her 3 times for total 6 hours. Imagine sitting in this chair in this woman's office, and she's very skeptical, the skeptical look across her face for 6 hours as she grills me and tries to decide whether I'm a good fit. But ultimately, I cleared that hurdle, and I got to be a school director. And I was the youngest school director in the system, and it was just because I've never worked so hard for a job in my life. But that was definitely the best thing to ever happen to me career-wise, was getting that job. Yeah. Finding a sympathetic, reasonable person who's not just trying to check boxes, getting past all the HR filters and stuff to an actual person whom you're going to be working alongside, right? And you said you're still friends and colleagues with this person to this day.
Yeah, that's right. And I think maybe one of the takeaways from this is for better or worse, you'll get lucky, and you're going to get unlucky too. In your career, and an important thing is just persistence and putting in the time and effort, however you can, because it's kind of like a shots on goal kind of thing, right? You just have to keep giving yourself opportunity. And then now I feel fortunate, I felt like I'm where I am now because of these, these kind of points in time where people took a chance on me. And so now I feel like I'm at a place where, that's kind of a way I want to be able to give back, is, taking similar chances on others. So.
Awesome. Yeah. And I'm 100% right there with you. Now that I have the capacity to be able to hire people, we've been very I just look for signal. I look for people who are very active in the open source community, and I'm like, hey, you've been super active for 2 years contributing to FreeCodeCamp's open source project. Would you like to be able to do this full time? That's basically people don't even know they're being interviewed, and then next thing you know, they're a team member if they say yes. A lot of people, they're like, well, I've already got this really good job at this big tech company, so but. And that's really cool too, is we have a lot of contributors who work at big tech companies or who work for, science, they're European Science Administration or something like that, right? And they're like, well, I don't want to quit working on, physics, but I do want to keep contributing to FreeCodeCamp. So that's an easy win in the sense that, yeah, sure, we would welcome you to continue to contribute. But what you just said about shots on goal and putting yourself out there and taking lots of chances, we had Logan Kilpatrick, who worked at OpenAI, and one of the things he said, I don't know where he is now, but he was working at OpenAI. He was their first ever developer advocate hire. And he said he measures his job applications in the hundreds because he just sits down and grinds out tons of applications. And that's how he got the job at OpenAI, and that's how he's got his other opportunities in the past. It's just brute force almost. Yeah. So
yeah, that's so funny.
I want to talk a little bit.
I was just gonna say, it's funny because where's Logan now? We're actually coworkers, so we are he's on a sister team to Kaggle within Google. So yeah, I know him.
Oh, cool! I didn't know that. I didn't know that's where he landed.
Yeah.
I just heard he left OpenAI. Well, that's really cool. So you know him.
Yeah. He's great. It's awesome.
Super chill dude. If you have time, listen to my interview with Logan, and there's a video version of it too. But yeah, he really inspiring figure. Really enjoyed talking with him. So I do want to talk a little bit about linguistics, if that doesn't seem like too much of a departure, because I'm really interested in studying foreign language. Everybody knows, I think that I lived in China for 6 years, and it was a huge part of my kind of educator origin story, teaching, factory workers in China and teaching engineers from Brazil, teaching them English, and then doing factory tours and interpreting and stuff. I love linguistics and I love learning languages, and I spend probably an hour a day listening to podcasts in foreign languages and stuff like that. And it is really cool and exciting to meet somebody who is also very passionate about language. So I just wanted to geek out about language for a little bit too, if the audience will indulge me. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. So you've lived abroad too. You mentioned you lived in France, and French, and now you're living in Canada, and we can absolutely talk about your journey to Canada. And you are an enthusiast of Cantonese, which is a dialect of Chinese that I spent a lot of time speaking, because my wife's from Canton. She's from Guangdong province. Yeah, so I'm going to be speaking a ton of Cantonese this summer when I'm staying with her parents again. And it's rare that I meet a Guaylo or a Guaypo who is studying Cantonese. Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. Oh, I did not know that you're also a Cantonese learner, speaker. Very awesome. Yeah, no, I'm super interested in language. And yeah, I did spend some time in France and felt like I think I really enjoyed learning French. Just, I don't know what it is exactly. It's sort of like it's hard to actually put words to it because I really enjoy like the sound systems of languages specifically. So I really enjoy like, learning like pronunciation essentially. And so I really enjoyed that about French. And so it was like very proud moments for me when I was living in France and people would talk to me like I was a local. I'd be like, yes, I'm passing as like French. And then, for Cantonese, like the thing is like learning the tones is a lot of fun. And I am making zero attempt to learn how to read or write at this point. So it's basically all, the pronunciation and everything. And super interesting. I just geek out about it. It's hard to even explain.
Yeah. And like in our generation, we're kind of experiencing like a shift in how Cantonese is spoken. Like if you talk to the old people in Cantonese, like they'll use like all 6 tones or 7 tones, I guess. Like they have like the high falling, but young people don't use high falling.
Yeah. No, I never used that. Yeah.
And sometimes I do hear it, but it's almost like a precision thing. It's like a prestige thing.
Oh, yeah. That's super interesting. Yeah. And so like my kind of, the reason that I'm learning have been learning Cantonese is my partner is Cantonese speaking. He is from Canada, but his family is from Hong Kong. And so he grew up speaking Cantonese at home. So he's a heritage speaker of Cantonese. And I think what's interesting about that is like learning, the Cantonese that he speaks is sort of like a Cantonese he learned from, a different generation than, even what people are speaking now in, parts of China and Hong Kong. And it's interesting when I notice like, some of the differences there. But
Yeah, and people who are interested in language, like I think about like language change all the time. I love like, I think it's like Oxford or Webster, like they put out their like word of the year and stuff like that. And like neologisms, like newly coined words and stuff like that. But just like the little shifts in language that we're experiencing, like we're not even necessarily aware of them, but like irregular verbs gradually becoming regular. Like, do you say, what is the past tense of to dive? Like to dive into a body of water.
See, I have like, my brain is broken on these things because I'm like, I know the answer is dived, but I want to say dove is what I would have like.
I think it used to be dove, and it's like,
yeah, exactly.
It's in flux, right? It's changing, right? Do people say dreamt or dreamed? Dreamed. Like I don't.
Yes.
I'm gonna have to like watch my kids carefully to see what they say because it may be different from what I say. Like language is changing all the time, and this is just one of those things that we're like swimming in it. We don't even think about it. It's like asking a fish, "How's the water?" What's water?
Yeah, exactly.
What is linguistic change? What is? And so I'm curious. Like you have this domain expertise. This field that you studied a ton, that you were working toward becoming one of the world experts in, like, changes in nasal sounds, for example. How is that level of attention to detail and care and interest in something that so many people just take for granted or don't even realize it's a phenomenon? Like, how has that informed kind of your day-to-day experience as a data scientist?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I do get this question a lot from linguists, honestly, who are like, do you use anything that you learned from linguistics in your day job as a product manager or as a data scientist? And I think, the specifics of what I've learned, like, different articulatory strategies for, nasal raising in vowels. Like, no, I can't say honestly that I use a lot of that kind of like minute detail and knowledge in my day-to-day. But, you know, I think I learned a lot of skills for, you know, like in statistics and kind of just general research methods that have been super useful for doing things like hypothesis testing, which, you know, we're constantly doing in, you know, data science and honestly also in product management. So being able to formulate a kind of like robust hypothesis, think really clearly about what kind of data and evidence do I need to build up to make, you know, an informed decision about different outcomes. Like I learned all of like the skills and things along those lines while studying linguistics. And then on the, you know, the things that are maybe a little bit more like domain specific, it's honestly just like a huge appreciation for that kind of variation and, you know, differences that you see in human populations, and taking that appreciation and applying it to the way I look at, you know, Kaggle's community, and just as a product manager of, you know, a website in general that has a lot of different users, and, you know, not ever taking for granted that people are going to experience things in the same way. There could be, yes, linguistic variation, but, you know, there's also things like, you know, accessibility and other ways that people vary and differ that, you know, I can kind of extrapolate from what I learned from, you know, linguistics and my focus on things like individual differences and variation. And I would also say, like, obviously, and, you know, specifically, you know, AI and machine learning, when we're in this kind of like large language model boom, a lot of, you know, what, you know, this technology is built on is in effect like linguistic, like language data, of course. And it's, I think, you know, something that we've learned time and time again is that these models are as good as the data that they're trained on. And in order to kind of like represent the, you know, the variation that we see in people's language, that data has to be captured in the data that was used to train these models. And so really gaining an appreciation for that specifically. And there's absolutely been times where there's things that people may take for granted because, you know, this is the right way to speak, or, you know, not really kind of realizing or noticing differences in the way different populations speak. And then not, as a result, kind of like overlooking you know, representation from important groups. So,
I mean, I'll give you like an example of just what you said. Like when I was, you know, a starry-eyed, you know, 23-year-old in China, who just finished college and was going to grad school, and like this whole new world was opening. You know, China at the time was the place to go if you were an ambitious young person. Like that's where like all the international trade, the economy was growing at like 8 to 11% a year. Like, there was so much opportunity out there. And, you know, this was after the tech bubble had burst. And like, so if you were looking for an ambitious people, they probably weren't in Silicon Valley necessarily. A lot of them were probably in Shanghai or Beijing, right? Or Guangzhou or Hong Kong. And so like me being out there, it's interesting what you said. Like subconsciously I gravitated towards speaking like the higher class, you know, the like with Cantonese. You know, like a lot of Hong Kongers, they don't pronounce the nasal N when they say, like, do you say Leho or do you say Neho, right? Like people in Guangzhou will say Neho, and that's like, for them, it's more precise and accurate. And technically it's easier to understand because if you collapse two consonants into one another, like you remove a lot of like the semantic, like whatever your brain hooks on to process the language. But in Hong Kong, it's just like lazier kind of like, but Hong Kong had more economic power and was more prestigious and stuff. So like I subconsciously, without even really thinking about it, I gravitated towards speaking like Hong Kongese. Even though I was in Guangzhou for most of the time. I didn't actually, I went to Hong Kong a lot, but I was mostly in Guangzhou and other Pearl River Delta cities. And it was weird because I would be talking in like a totally different kind of like dialect than the people around me. Like my father-in-law speaks Dongguan dialect, which is different. It's got like 5 tones instead of 6 or 7. And it's like they blur a lot of their kind of vowel, like the diphthongs. Like the vowel clusters just become, what are they called? Monophthongs or something like that. Again, I apologize. Yeah. Like I don't have, is that the word for them?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Monophthongs.
Oh, monophthongs. Yeah. So like, it was really weird because I almost felt like, I don't know, like it made it did affect how I like looked at like, oh, it's kind of like a bumpkin way of talking, like why don't they talk like they talk on TV, right? And that's another big issue is like in America, like as a kid growing up in Oklahoma City, a lot of people around me spoke kind of like Southern style English, like they would slur their words together,
right?
Or they would say things like y'all and stuff like that. And like for me, I was like, no, like how do they talk in New York City, or more like probably ambitiously, how do they talk in LA? Because LA is like the center of like U.S. culture essentially, like with Hollywood and everything. So like I always gravitated toward that, and it occurs to me like just for the past few days while I was thinking about interviewing with you,
yeah,
that it was kind of like a classist weird kind of thing, like it's some weird latent part of my humanity that like almost like wants to think of myself as nobility or something above like commoners. Isn't that weird?
Yeah, no, but it's also totally natural. I mean, you're not making necessarily like a conscious, decision to say, oh, I'm going to, say lay-ho instead of nay-ho. I'm also a lay-hoer. But, you don't make a conscious decision about the vowels and the consonants and, diphthongs and things like that. Like, but, something in you, maybe, not conscious either, but maybe a little less unconscious, is trying to say like, hey, I'm not trying to convey an identity where I'm from Oklahoma everywhere that I go in the world. You want to convey like more of like a global identity, and there's different strategies that you're deploying to do that. And it's seeing how people talk in communities that you want to associate yourself with. It's how you dress. It's it's just another part of your identity, and I totally like sympathize with all of that as well. Like one interesting sort of like case study almost is, I mentioned I've lived all these different various places. My family is originally from Minnesota, and all of my immediate family still lives in Minnesota. And yes, if you talk to me, eventually you may hear me say certain things where you're like, okay, she's definitely from Minnesota. But you'll get that sense like immediately talking to anybody in my family. It's a much stronger accent. And, my family, I have two sisters. They've always lived in Minnesota. Their identity is Minnesota. And I think, just like all of us, they are also exposed to and familiar with, the Hollywood, and, social, like, or sort of like cultural, different ways in our culture we hear, different dialects of English. They're exposed to that as well. But, they're from Minnesota and they want to be a Minnesotan, and that's great. But, I don't sound as Minnesotan as they do.
It occurs to me like yeah. So Minnesota, Oklahoma, these are both like kind of like landlocked, like flyover country, as people on the coast might refer to them. Minnesota's a really nice place, by the way. I was there like a couple years ago, where Prince is from. I didn't make it to Paisley Park, but I will one day make a pilgrimage out. But yeah, like it's not like an S tier city. Like when you go abroad and you introduce it like, oh, I'm from Oklahoma City, people are like, where's that? Or they're like, oh, like cowboys and stuff. And I'm like, well, 150 years ago, cowboys.
Right.
But it's like if you go, like my friend. So I had this experience. Like I was in Shanghai running the school, and I hired an academic director. He was from New York, and he had like a very rough like Brooklyn accent, and he's very kind of like blunt and fast talking and stuff. And information is communicated very quickly in New York, and like there's like a lot of people don't have much of a filter. There's again like. This is not everybody. I don't want to overgeneralize New Yorkers, but like from kind of a socio-linguistic standpoint, like it's very different from Texas, where I live currently, or Southern California, where I lived for a while, or Northern California. Southern California and Northern California are very different culturally, in aggregate, of course, like they're individual people. There are plenty of university professors in Oklahoma City who talk more like somebody from LA than somebody from Oklahoma City, for example. But like one of the things that occurs, I'm sorry, I'm kind of like rambling, but I'm just like really interested. I feel like you and I have a lot in common. And part of this might be because you have an excellent blog that you don't update like super often, but you are incredibly candid on that blog. Like you talk about like everything that is of interest to you, like all these movies. You talk about how you watched the movie Akira like 20 times or something one year. And it's
Probably
really
more,
cool to like read your like years in review. Yeah.
And now I feel guilty. I haven't done my year in review for last year.
Well, it's never too late. I guess if you I don't know if you keep like contemporaneous notes of like different things going on, or you could piece it together from like emails or something. But like it's interesting. Like even though it's very hard to find like interviews with you, like I can only find like one podcast interview with you ever on Apple Podcast, and then of course I watched several episodes of Sliced, which is your data science, game show, essentially where you pit different data scientists against one another with like a model, and they have to very quickly I'm trying to think. It's like American Ninja Warrior for statistics almost. I'm not sure how to like describe the show. Maybe you could describe the show real quick.
Well, yeah, we called it Chopped for data science. So the cooking show. If you're familiar,
Chopped
in
for data
the
science. I've
show
never seen Chopped.
Yeah. So you get like a basket of ingredients, and you get some set amount of time to create a recipe with it. And it's similar with Sliced. We gave people not a basket of ingredients, but we gave them a data set and a task, and then they had 2 hours to live code and make a submission to a Kaggle competition, while myself and my co-host Nick Wan commentated live. So that was Sliced.
Yeah. So Sliced is available on Nick's YouTube channel. I'm going to link to it in the show notes, and I'll also link to meg.dev, which you got a great domain, by the way.
Perfect.
Very very succinct. Yes. But I guess one of the things I was saying is like, even though there's not a lot of information about you, frankly, like I always do a lot of research before I come into these, and it may be to the detriment because like I'm like waxing poetically about some random blog post you wrote like years ago that you don't even remember or something. But I think I read like almost every article on your blog and stuff. And what I was reading is like, wow, she's got like really interesting interests. Like you're clearly somebody who has like kind of nuanced taste when it comes to like music and film. Like you have like this Letterboxd account that's just like every single movie I don't know if you report all of them, but you watch a ton of movies, and like all the books you read, like you track all this stuff. It's almost like quantified self for media consumption. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like what inspires you to put so much of your information out there?
In terms of like my media consumption, or do you mean like even just my blog about like, wow, that's a great question. I mean, honestly, it's part of like, I've always felt like I've had a really good time just being online and being on the internet. Like I feel like I have been, a diehard Twitter fan for a super long time as well. And it's brought me a lot of like really great connections with the community. I've made friends this way. People that I have actually hired, and maybe some of them even still work at Kaggle, I've met through Twitter and social media. And so I've just found it's been an easy way for me as an introvert to, just make connections with people out there in the world. I have an easier time doing that than, just, I guess, striking up a conversation maybe in person. I think I've gotten better at doing that over time, and, have a great, friend network here in Toronto. But it's also been super rewarding to be able to travel to, a ton of different cities, and then almost be guaranteed to know somebody wherever I'm going, and, have somebody that, I have something in common with there. And so I think like sharing my interests and who I am to some degree online, whether that's like, Twitter or my thoughts on my blog, or just kind of sharing the things I'm interested in, in terms of like movies, especially on Letterboxd. Like it's all kind of maybe part of that.
Yeah. I mean, do you have like a filter? Like, are there things like where you're like, oh, I'm really kind of embarrassed that I watched, like my dirty kind of like my guilty pleasure, I guess, is watching like Miami Vice. Like I just love watching like, 80s TV shows that are not like, and Miami Vice is actually like fairly cerebral. There are like a lot more like just ridiculous shows like MacGyver and stuff from the 80s, but like, but I love to just like, pop some popcorn and make like an omelet for lunch and just like put on an episode of like season 2 or season 3 Miami Vice. Those are my favorite seasons, and just like watch the absurdity unfold. But I wouldn't like document that. I wouldn't tell people today I watched, like season 3 episode 5 of Miami Vice. Cause like I almost feel people would be like, why is the founder of freeCodeCamp watching Miami Vice when he should be building, open learning resources? or like I went through a period where I watched a ton of like American Gladiators because there was this documentary series on Netflix, and I was just like, oh man, I got to go back and watch Nitro throw people off like pillars and stuff. Yeah. But yeah, like so is your Letterboxd complete and all inclusive, or do you watch a lot of stuff that you're like guilty pleasures that you're too embarrassed to put up there?
It is complete. I have no filter, and I don't think you should either. Like you're sharing with me right now for the public record that you watch Miami Vice while eating popcorn and omelets. Like what? I feel people shouldn't need to defend their guilty pleasures or have like a filter necessarily. Like I personally love everything and anything, and I definitely don't have a filter. I'm not trying to, kind of put on airs about like, oh, I have like a refined taste of some kind, in movies, and so that's all you're going to see from me. I'm not a movie critic either. Like I just enjoy watching movies, and so if I were a movie critic and I was putting, time and effort into, reviewing, critiquing movies, maybe I would have a little bit more curation to that. But a big part of it is, I don't know, just like this weird quantified self like drive to just, document everything. And so like, for example, if you go on my Letterboxd, I've used it for, a number of years. There was like a period where I just kind of dropped off and forgot about Letterboxd for a while. And I don't know why I had this compulsion, but once I realized like, oh, I should go back to using Letterboxd, I wanted to align it with like the calendar year. So I actually waited until the new year started before recording everything again. Because I didn't want my stats to say, oh, Meg, you only watched 13 movies this year. Like, I just was like, no. So that's like, I don't know. It's just like a weird anal kind of thing more than anything, I would say. But yeah, I'm a big believer in not feeling too much shame about your guilty pleasures. So you can feel free in my mind. But yeah.
Do you have any guilty pleasure like viewing that you're not ashamed of, because you said you shouldn't feel shame of it, but you do realize like this is like that, like I think like the lowest brow thing I ever watched was like I watched Flavor of Love like with Flavor Flav. I watched it on double speed and I watched it on YouTube. Like I just found some old episodes and it's just absurd. This guy with the clock, like, and all these women trying to woo him, and like the ridiculousness of the drama, and like, it was, and I could only get through a few episodes of it, but it was like, man, that is like some wild TV. And I was not in the moment. Like I wasn't watching it when everybody else was watching it. And I think at one point it was like it was like the big thing that everybody watched, but it was like years later. So it was like particularly guilty and weird that like, or like last night for the first time ever, I watched like the Charlie Sheen interview where he was like talking about winning and stuff. I'd never watched that before. Right. And I was just like, I wonder what.
It's like the tiger blood.
But I would, I mean, I'm saying it now because it's almost like a public confessional. but basically, I did feel like really weird watching that. Like there has to be something more productive. Like these are valuable seconds of my existence on this planet, that I'm spending listening to Charlie Sheen rant.
Yeah.
Do you have anything like that?
Yeah. Do I have anything like that? I would put almost nothing that I watch in terms of movies into that category. Like, I am like proud about everything that I watch, and I do like watch total schlock too, for sure. And so, like, big fan of Mystery Science Theater 3000. If you're familiar, it's a show where they a couple of characters, a guy and his two robot buddies, watch and kind of riff on like just horrible B movies, and it's some of the like worst stuff ever, but it's so good at the same time. Like, I love all of that. I would say in the guilty pleasure category, though, there is the TV shows. That's where I'm like wasting precious seconds of my life watching stuff like Married at First Sight. Huge fan. I have actually published a data set on Kaggle on Married at First Sight, couples
Married
and
at First
outcomes.
Sight.
So, yeah, I really like these kinds of shows that are like, how would I put it? Like, they're almost like social. A lot of reality TV is kind of like a social experiment, but Married at First Sight in particular, I'm really interested in sort of like for whatever reason, like the romantic, like a relationship based like reality TV shows, and Married at First Sight is one where they pair two people who've obviously never seen each other just based on whatever psychological profiles and interviews that they've done, and so there's a little bit of that, like they're trying to like do some matchmaking, but I like watching these shows and don't feel like that they're a total waste of time either, because a lot of the conversations and scenarios that you see them in like end up being kind of good fodder for self-reflection, I find, and kind of thinking about like my own relationships and like, how to conduct myself in these kind of scenarios. And I think that has made shows like Married at First Sight a lot more interesting, especially in their kind of like earlier seasons, because I think it was like a little bit more true to the experiment. Whereas like as it gets more into like just sensationalism and kind of like exploiting these people, that's less interesting to me. But I could go on that tangent for a while, Married at First Sight and things like that. But yeah. And then I had my whole Akira thing, where during the pandemic, I just like lost my mind a little bit and watched Akira like definitely more than 20 times. But I am thoroughly obsessed. It's my number one favorite movie. You'll see it on Letterboxd, but yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a really cool movie. If anybody hasn't seen it, 1988. Like there's so many memes about like, walking to the bike and it's a brilliant movie, but there are actually a lot of little flaws in the animation. Like I watched some like frame by frame analysis. There's like what's called like pop over, where certain visual, the way they film these, they have the different cells, they're moving around, they're pointing a camera at it. Like sometimes the frames would be out of sequence or something like that. And since it's happening at 24 frames a second, you don't realize that like that street light just appears for like one frame and then disappears, or the building, like the parallax effect is off or something like that. But it's amazing to me that in such like a masterpiece, there are still like flaws that you can find. Just shows like even like when you're trying to get something out the door, there's real economic pressure. Like that movie did have a budget and it did have a deadline, and they couldn't make it perfect, even though they had so much to work with, right? They had the classic manga as their source material. Beautiful art style in that manga too, if you get a chance to read the manga.
Yes. Highly recommend.
So we could definitely talk about media and your consumption of media, but I do want to like jump over. There was this really interesting interregnum in your career, like this break from working at Kaggle, where you went and worked at Stack Overflow. And I'm really interested in what it was like doing community at Stack Overflow after you've done. So you have like a Kaggle sandwich or like a Stack Overflow sandwich. Kaggle was the bread, basically, in your career. And maybe you could talk about what led up to going to Stack Overflow and then what it was like there when you were there.
Yes. So I was working at Kaggle for a few years at that point, and I had kind of transitioned from a data science role to product management, which is the role that I'm in now. But at the time at Kaggle, we were still a really small, super scrappy team. And, I found myself in a situation where I was kind of the only full-time product manager, similar to how previously I had been like the only and first data scientist in my previous job prior to Kaggle. And so that left me feeling like, hey, I want to find my quote unquote community of product managers or something like that, so to speak. And so I found Stack Overflow as just like a company really appealing because honestly, my personal brand at this point is like online technical communities and building up, knowledge about technical concepts and ideas. And I also knew that they had a more mature product function. And so it was honestly very much kind of a career advancement kind of thing that I was after, just kind of, looking to grow my professional career in that way. And saw this as like a really great opportunity to do that and continue to work on the stuff that I'm passionate about. I joined Stack Overflow and I was there for a pretty short stint. So a little bit less than a year. And it was a very interesting experience. What to even say about it? I worked on what everybody knows and loves of Stack Overflow, like Q&A. So, they have a big product management team. A lot of people worked on things like ads or Teams, which was their kind of like SaaS version of Stack Overflow for companies. At the time, they had a jobs board, which I think they've since kind of shut down, but then maybe brought back. I worked on Stack Overflow and the Stack Exchange network. It was an interesting experience because the team was really small that was working on just like the core Stack Overflow community. So it was really kind of interesting because it was just like, how do you prioritize? It was just, how do you do as much as possible with the small team that you have? I think I had like, maybe five or six engineers that I worked directly with, a designer, a UX researcher, and then community managers. How do we do as much as possible that we can for the community, but Stack Overflow is a huge community. I worked with a larger team on Kaggle. Kaggle's a much smaller community, much smaller kind of footprint, whereas Stack Overflow is just millions and millions and millions of developers. And they also had a really vocal, impassioned sub-communities within Stack Overflow, right? At Stack Overflow, and if you're part of the community, you call this like the meta community. So there's like this meta site where that's where people who in the community who are very passionate about the community kind of go to discuss various affairs going on, kind of direction of the site. And then there's also elected moderators that we're working with. And so just like the way that the community was kind of segmented was pretty different from Kaggle. I think there's a lot that honestly Kaggle hoped to learn from the way kind of Stack Overflow matured in good ways and in bad ways. Kind of like getting in the weeds of those different communities was interesting and not without a lot of challenge. I'll be honest. It was if you look at my history and you look at the timeline of Stack Overflow, you'll see there's definitely some certain strife going on in the community that was challenging.
Yeah, can you talk about that a little bit? We're several years past that. Stack Overflow has been acquired by Naspers, which is a giant South African private equity firm, essentially.
Private equity.
They own a significant chunk of I think Alibaba, or was it Tencent? It was one of the big Chinese companies. They have a huge chunk of it. They have many tens of billions of dollars worth of equity in this company, and that's kind of been the one investment that's helped them grow. But they bought Stack Overflow, right? I've interviewed Jeff Atwood. I've interviewed Joel Spolsky. But those are both, they're the two founders of Stack Overflow. There were other early people at Stack Overflow, but they're kind of seen as the two kind of father figures of Stack Overflow. Mm-hmm. And They didn't really go into it. But what was it like on the ground, like during some of these more tumultuous periods? Because there were like, I remember, I don't know the exact chronology, but there was like a lot of backlash and like a lot of, prominent moderators and other people like leaving. And Stack Overflow was structured in a way that it did give a lot of power to the individual contributors and moderators. Yes. And so they had like a pretty outsized voice. And it was one of the most public kind of like conflicts I've ever seen. Were you there during this period?
Yes, I was.
You were there. Okay. I just want to make sure. Like,
yep.
If you wouldn't mind, like, I would love to learn more about what the saga was like, the Stack Overflow saga.
Yeah, I mean, I can share, some observations from it. Like, I don't, there's already a lot that's like been set up. Like, if you dig deep into the internet, like archives and things like that, you'll find, different accounts and things like that. I'm not the best person to provide the full accounting because I did leave before a lot of that was resolved, and then the next kind of like tumultuous period, happened or whatever. But I think what was interesting for me was, coming to Stack Overflow when it was in this kind of like leadership transition period, because we had, of course, Joel and Jeff Atwood who kind of like set this very clear North Star for what Stack Overflow is. And they were super principled. They were also super transparent in sharing those principles and inviting the community to take a lot of ownership over those principles and how they kind of influence the direction of the site, the way things work, like as you noted. And I think that's like amazing community building, right? Like when you can bring together people in the community to share in a common outcome that you want. In this case, it was like high quality Q&A. And people feel like a vested interest in seeing that outcome through, and they understand and see all the mechanics that are at their disposal for making it happen. Like that's amazing. But when I joined, it was going through like this, like I mentioned, this leadership transition. And so they were bringing on a new leadership team. Joel had stepped away. We had a new CEO. And, the goals were to, get to a sale, right? Like that's what ultimately happened, right?
So even back then, that's what they were thinking. Just to be clear, that was like kind of like a tacit knowledge, I guess, among the staff that they were trying to get bought by somebody that, if you don't mind me asking, like why?
Or some other.
Why did they want?
I mean, my understanding would be just, the board shareholders want to see, some kind of, sale or IPO or some kind of outcome along those lines. So, it's just, the way things go with that. It happened to Kaggle too. I mean, we had an exit with Google. And so, but could have, easily been another outcome like that. So that's really tough because, there's just no way that we could expect our leadership to have that same level of, or even just kind of like carbon copy the same vision that Joel and Jeff had originally kind of established for Stack Overflow. And that's like, so trying to navigate the right way to preserve that and to kind of like maintain some momentum for the community while also trying to take the company in a different, kind of direction. Like that's just no matter who you are and, what kind of leader you are, reckoning with, that kind of legacy and trying to make a change is going to be painful. And, yes, I think like for sure there were, mistakes that the company and different leaders, made at the time. But at the same time, I think it's the kind of thing that, might have been inevitable. And I think the place that I wanted to have when I was at Stack Overflow was to just continue to be like a human to the community through all of this. I think it was very easy for a lot of people to find it scary to interface with the community. And in this kind of situation to just kind of like pull back and say, ooh, they're not gonna like this, so we're just gonna hold these plans close to our chest. We'll deal with the fallout, whatever it may be, later or something like that along those lines. And for me, coming from, working with a community in the past and somebody who's honestly fairly transparent and open about the things that are on my mind, the things I'm doing, like I am personally a lot more comfortable being an interface with a community, as, scary as it may be sometimes. And so I think doing my best in like the deluge of community feedback, that we're dealing with, to show and actually convey to people and, show them that we were hearing, the things that they were saying, and making decisions from that and being transparent about that. Just doing my best. But yeah, it was a tough period, I will say. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you kind of volunteered to step into the breach, so to speak, because your personality is just like, hey, I like being open. Like, you're incredibly transparent. Yeah. Like I said on your blog, you share lots of information on Twitter that is not flattering to yourself, but you share it anyway because that's who you are, right? Yeah. And which I think is admirable. And a lot of people don't have the courage to just be themselves online because there are lots of trolls who will make fun of you for being yourself, right? Or will think you're dumb and stop listening to you or something like that, right? Like, I think a lot of people listening to this are probably very careful about what they put online. And frankly, I'm careful about what I put online, and I want to become more courageous like you. Hopefully without like inviting some sort of controversy over something that gets taken out of context or something like that. But since you love being transparent and you love working directly with communities, it sounds like you kind of like volunteered to like put yourself in the line of fire, if you will. Like, is that an accurate assessment of like your time at Stack Overflow?
Yeah, I think it's accurate. Like I was willing to be on the ground and talk to, a lot of the community members that were, quite angry, right? I don't want to say though that I did some heroic, valiant thing either, because I had a lot of luxury coming from a point of like, hey, I'm new here. I'm new. I didn't create a lot of the mess that, you're experiencing right now. So it was easier for me than it would have been for a lot of people who had been there for a long time, who had been burned many times. And so, yeah, it may be right, but I don't want to make it seem like, I was some like hero charging into the fray either. But yeah.
Well, you're very modest, but like certainly from what it looks like from the outside, it looks like you didn't have to do that, and yet you're like, let's try it. Was it like a career growth thing? I mean, you talked about wanting to go to Stack Overflow because there were so many other PMs, and you'd have more peers, and you'd be able to learn. I guess I'm curious, like, when you decided to leave, and if you can talk about like the sequence of events that caused you to go back to Kaggle. And did you go directly back to Kaggle from Stack Overflow?
I did. Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you could talk about that period.
Yeah. Like I said, I didn't stay for longer than a year. I was there for less than a year. I'm proud of that. I think there's a lot of still a lot of like scrutiny around like job hopping and stuff like that. And, I don't feel that was sort of like what I was doing. And I'm proud of, we had a really productive year while I was on the team. I got that feedback. And so, things were going, great kind of in that regard, building up a lot more momentum for a lot of really important work. But at the same time, like I mentioned, there was a lot of turnover on the leadership team. And the direction of the company was different from what brought me there originally. Like I said, my personal brand is pretty deeply tied to online technical communities who are building and sharing, validating knowledge. And that became kind of less core and central to the things that were important for Stack Overflow at the time. Of course, like maintaining that was important, but a lot of focus shifted to other things. And so it just felt like it's so important for me to be passionate about what I'm working on that, that combined with an opportunity to come back to Kaggle was enough for me to decide that was the right kind of life move. Because also, frankly, there was, there was this strife going on, and it was not personally fun. It wasn't, there were some rough moments there that were, a little tough, personally speaking. So, and Kaggle's a great team. It's a great community. It's everything that I love and I'm passionate about. So,
well, you are an expert in online communities, having worked at two of the biggest kind of like developer communities. I mean, like when I think about them, like, Kaggle and Stack Overflow, I can't even really think of any communities that are comparable in size. I mean, you might, if you consider like, Leak Code or Top Code or some of these like to be communities, even though they're just like competitive. They're similarly competitive sites, but they don't have like the open data sets that Kaggle has and like all the open tools that I know of. They're more just like a means to an end. Like they're a step toward getting a job as a developer or proving your credentials. Whereas Kaggle, people stick around for years and continue to contribute data sets, and lots of people in the field continue to use it. So, and I guess technically people might be going back to Top Coder to get even deeper into like, writing algorithms and data structures so they can apply for even more elite jobs and things like that. But yeah, like you've worked at two of the biggest communities is what I'm trying to say. What are some of the biggest mistakes you've seen online communities make? Not just like the ones that you've worked at, but like looking around at other communities, like I guess specifically developer community. I mean, you could say there's been like plenty of mistakes made over at Twitter recently, in my opinion. And if you like, we can talk about that, because I know you're big on Twitter. Like that's like one of your big outlets to express yourself. But like, what are some of the biggest mistakes you've seen online communities make and the people who manage them make?
Wow. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the biggest mistakes I see is actually something you kind of alluded to, which is thinking you have a community when you really don't. Because a lot of people do describe, places where developers might go as like a community. But I think like what a community really needs is some, sort of like common goal or, common like outcome or task or experience that they're sharing and, working towards together, or otherwise kind of like, having exchanges about together. It's really like, there needs to be kind of like a community of practice, and kind of to use like a more kind of technical term. And like there's a lot of things that go wrong when you think you have a community and you don't, or like you don't appreciate that what you have is a community and you treat it like it's not. And so, maybe like, one, thing I could talk about a little bit is, it's interesting being a community product at a company like Google, where Google does not do community products as kind of like a general thing very well. So there's, they had, G Plus or Google Plus, or, they made an attempt at like a social network, right? That didn't go well. So it's very unique being a community like Kaggle at Google, where we're kind of constantly, having to kind of explain what is important about what a community is versus like, oh, we're just like a website with a lot of users. Like it's very easy to just view that as like a mailing list, and you can just kind of like, it's enough to have like a newsletter to, that you're blasting out, and call that a community. But really you need something that is actually bringing people together. And so Quincy, I love your newsletter. It's great because it's like so like succinct and to the point. But it's way more than just that makes the Free Code Camp community. It's the ways that you bring people together to create cohorts of people working on course material together, or the local meetups. I was doing Free Code Camp when I was living in Pittsburgh, and there was like a Pittsburgh meetup of people who are like also learning software engineering kind of stuff or web development stuff. And so it's a lot of things can go wrong when you think your newsletter is a community. Essentially.
I think Pittsburgh, by the way, really cool city. I had never been there before, but I went there last year, and super chill. Like everybody on the street was like just super kind. So I'm just going to wax poetically about Pittsburgh, and I'm going to go again this year, and I'm going to visit the Tower of Learning. Have you been there?
Ooh,
the Tower of Learning.
It's beautiful. Yeah. Yes.
Awesome.
Highly recommend it.
So I'm not like crazy for wanting to go there. It's worth driving out there. Okay, so maybe you can tell us a little bit about, like, as a segue. We'll get back to communities, but just the Tower of Learning is so cool. And you're the first person I've met who actually lives in Pittsburgh, or lived in Pittsburgh. So, and you've been to the Tower of Learning, so you've already checked 2 of the boxes nobody's checked before. So maybe you can tell us what this building is.
Oh, honestly, I don't know that much about it, except for I think there's linguistics, like the linguistics department at it's UPitt, right? At Pitt has offices there. I think it's Pitt and not Carnegie Mellon. They're right next to each other. But yeah, that's about what I know about it, is the linguistics department. I don't know if it's like classrooms or might be just faculty. But I know then on the bottom floor, like during Christmas, they do all of these like different exhibits for like different cultures around the world. At least they did when I was there. I wish I could remember what it was called. I did not expect to be talking about this, but it is very cool. And nearby, you should check out Shenley Park as well. It's just gorgeous. And there's a botanical garden
Shenley Park
nearby as well. So yeah. Oh, and you got to get a
and just a quick
like
correction
fish sandwich.
Okay, cool. Thanks for the tip. Just a quick correction. It's called the Cathedral of Learning, not the Tower of Learning. It is the tallest educational related building in the world, at least in the United States. It may have been passed by some crazy, Middle Eastern project or something at this point. But
I'm sure.
But what you just said about like the different world cultures, there are like different rooms they're called nationality rooms, and there are 31 of them.
That's it. Yeah.
And so there's like a China room, and there's like a Netherlands room, and there's all the different I guess big countries. Like a lot of them have rooms there. So the rooms are kind of like decorated, and it's kind of like a little mini United Nations type thing going on in there, which is very worldly.
Yeah.
So
yes.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hitting it up. I'm really excited because if you go up, there's actually like the higher you go up in the building, like the more ornate it gets. I understand. Like there's like an actual like commons room that's structured like a big kind of like European cathedral, in Gothic style. So yeah, random thing. If you're traveling to Pittsburgh,
I'm excited for
check
you.
it. Yeah, thanks. So getting back to what you were saying about communities. So the biggest mistake you think is thinking you have a community when you don't have a community. Let's say somebody listening does have, like, they've got like a Patreon, or they've got they're like a Twitch streamer, or they create YouTube videos, or they write books or tutorials and like publish them on FreeCodeCamp, or publish them and like put a paywall part of them or something like that. That's a very common thing. Like people put them on like Gumroad or some website like that. Like here's my in-depth guide to R or something like that, right? What would be some first things that people could do if they want to turn it from like just a newsletter into a proper community where people are, I think you used the term like practice oriented or community of practice?
Like community of practice.
How do you build a
Yeah.
community of practice? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, great question. I mean, the first place you have to start, though, is thinking through why. Why do you want to turn your newsletter or your audience into a community? Because, the goals that you have ultimately are ones that you should probably share with that community. Like, the community should be aware of those goals. As, we kind of talked about in the Stack Overflow instance, I kind of lauded like Jeff and Joel for being so transparent about, here's the North Star for what Stack Overflow is. Community, this is your North Star as well. Like, help me build this together. So, you really have to figure out, like, why do you want a community in the first place? So maybe to give like an example, I have a friend who has kind of here in the in the Toronto area who has been for a number of years building up a community of AI and machine learning practitioners, and he does things like reading groups for the community. So bringing people to read together to read a paper. He does like demo day style things. He brings in invited speakers to give talks. Some of this had been in person, but a lot of it now is online. And, that's a great thing to put out there and kind of bring people together. But his goal is to find talent for his startup. Because occasionally he needs to hire contractors. And so it's a really good way for him to have like, a community of people whose kind of like work he's like super familiar with. And, he's also able to then, help other people looking for talent, like identify people in that community. And so having that clarity of like what your goal is super helpful in kind of shaping the way that he's approached building this community. So it's important to have, as part of, the community of practice type of stuff, opportunities for people to showcase their skills and talents. So, inviting people to do the demo day thing, for example. He also, one thing I observe about him too is he, lets a lot of people in the community kind of like self-organize certain things as well, which gives people kind of this opportunity to like, showcase like leadership, and kind of like organizational skills and things like that. I find it like he's been really successful in creating this community because he's got such kind of clear, clarity of purpose. And so I would spend a lot of time thinking about that question and, thinking about like, what are you trying to get out of this? How can you make it valuable for people in the community? One other thing I'll mention is, and this is somewhat also back to your question about like ways communities can fail. This is something that I've learned from both Stack Overflow and Kaggle is, say you've got a community that's like really successful and everybody's on the same page about why they're there and what they're getting out of it, what you're getting out of it, and everybody feels like they're kind of like all driving towards that. Once that community really grows, a challenge you have is like, say, as you might expect, like trying to like scale that level of like community alignment, where not everybody may be aware of that, and it gets harder and harder to treat your community so like kind of homogeneously, because now you have kind of like these old timers, so to speak, or people who are very aligned with like what your goals are, and then you have maybe like newer users who don't know that, and they may be like constantly contravening the rules, and there can be kind of like then a lot of clashing between newer and older users, and I think it's also something that's like super pertinent to both Stack Overflow and Kaggle, because what you need for communities like those to be valuable is to have people who have knowledge and expertise who are willing to share that with people who have less knowledge and expertise. And so you really need there to be like a good vibe between, people who are maybe more kind of like learners and then people who are more, senior and expertise and, experts. And so when you have like a site or a community where there's a lot of, it's maybe overpowered by learners, there's just more of those people in the world, that might lead to less value for people who are experts because they're like, I don't need to know how to install like a Python package anymore. Like that's not the kind of content I'm interested in. I'm more interested in like, really technical stuff. And so trying to find that balance is one of the things that it's easiest to go wrong, hardest to achieve. And so, there's some more thoughts for you.
Yeah, that's a lot. So just to kind of recapitulate some of the things you said, first you have to have like a clarity of a goal in why you're even creating a community. It's not necessary in a lot of cases. Maybe you're a musician and you just play music and people, buy your albums on, not CD Baby. What's the place people use nowadays? Bandcamp or something like that. And they're just like, they enjoy your music, but they don't necessarily have to talk to each other and geek out about your latest release. Sure, it's great if you can build like a Swifties type thing where everybody loves your music. They come together and all that stuff, but it isn't necessarily necessary. And I imagine creating a community is a lot of work and maintaining it. Yeah. And then what you said about just trying to like, you're always going to have kind of like those people that arrive first that are like, I knew this band before they were cool. And, now all these people are like, I could easily see how somebody who's like a big Pink Floyd fan would be kind of upset that like people who don't even listen to Pink Floyd are just wearing like the iconic, Dark Side of the Moon logo shirts or like Led Zeppelin shirts have become really trendy now. And like a lot of people may be like, well, I actually like, saw Led Zeppelin before they broke up or something like that. Right. Or, there can be that kind of like tribe. I'm not sure if it's like tribalism, but like basically like generationalism, like intergenerational warfare in terms of like fandom. And also it can be annoying to like answer the same question about, Roger Waters or something like for the 15th time on a forum when you're like much more interested in like the more minute, like things that people don't talk about or something like So I can definitely see just from that silly musical example I came up with that there would be strife among the ranks, so to speak. Yeah. So achieving a level of community alignment at scale, it's like a balancing act that, I mean, it sounds like you've learned a lot about this over the years. Like, what are some of like the biggest takeaways? Okay, let's say somebody is going to create a community or somebody like just tell me. It's like, so FreeCodeCamp, I'll just give you a quick rundown of the FreeCodeCamp community. So we have about 1 million people using it every day. Most people are just using the core curriculum or the reading the reference materials. Some people hang out on the Discord. Some people hang out on the forum. And then we do still have some local groups that meet and code together and stuff. But like a lot of that was just completely destroyed. Like most meetup infrastructure was destroyed during the pandemic. So a lot of that is kind of slowly building back. But a lot of that has moved to like online. It's kind of up in the air, frankly. The forum and the Discord are like like the forum has never been healthier. It's getting like, I don't know, 7 or 8 million page views a month. It's a lot. But at the same time, once you travel outside of like those online spaces to like individual learners, I'm not sure how connected like a person who signs up, for FreeCodeCamp and maybe they opt into my newsletter, and then maybe they're getting my email newsletter. Maybe they're listening to the podcast periodically. Maybe they're subscribed to the YouTube channel and they're seeing like the quantum computing algorithms course that we just published, which is like a 2.5 hour math course, like they're seeing things like that. So they might feel some degree of connection, but it's not like what your friend was like did where they have like a bunch of data scientists in Toronto who have a ton of stuff in common. We're all looking for jobs who all benefit directly from knowing one another, talking to one another, like learning from one another and getting connected through one another and like finding jobs through one another. Like that's a very clear kind of community purpose where there's like a community of practice alignment in a sense. Maybe they're giving lightning talks. Maybe they're collaborating on projects. Maybe they're having like data science hackathon type things. what advice would you give to me? What, just using what you know about FreeCodeCamp, using what I just told you, for how the FreeCodeCamp community might be able to do better, and engage people more, and pull more, I guess, marginal FreeCodeCamp community members in and make them kind of super community members, and galvanize them to help more people. That's a huge question.
Yeah.
But like, just general tips you would have, because I think a lot of people listening maybe they won't be in a community like FreeCodeCamp that's our scale and our size and the breadth of mission and everything, but they may have like, a local coding club, or they may have a bunch of people that watch them live code on Twitch or something like that. So yes, please critique my performance as a community manager.
Yeah. So I'll take it for granted that, you want to, create more of a community within FreeCodeCamp. And so I think there's like a few things that like come to mind. So like this whole community of practice thing, in Kaggle's context, it's a competition. In, the context of a community, a website like FreeCodeCamp, I can imagine something like a project. And I know like there's a lot of like focus on creating individual portfolio style projects. And I would think about ways to do more kind of like cohort based projects, if that's not already something that's part of FreeCodeCamp. And you may, again, this is all going to come from whatever your goals are. So I'm like working backwards here. It may be, you want to give people more experience in collaborative settings. That's important for, say that's really important for, showcasing skills that you need to either get a, transition into tech or advance your career in tech. And so group work, essentially. And, one, idea is I actually really like, I don't know if you're familiar with Replit, the kind of like hosted AI data science IDE thing.
We've developed some courses with grants from them. Nice.
That's awesome. Yeah. And so they have like this, I don't really know how this feature is doing, but they have a feature I really like quite a lot called bounties, where, someone, an individual or a company or something like that is looking to have, a piece of work done, where, Replit may be some means to that end, getting that project built. And, people in the community can, take these bounties and, to work on these projects essentially. And it would be like a cool idea to have something like that with FreeCodeCamp, because the thing that Kaggle really brings is a huge diversity in the kinds of things people are working on, with a fresh rotating slate of competitions. Like we always have new problems and new challenges, and so I think maybe it's not necessarily like companies bringing projects or portfolio work to be done for FreeCodeCamp, but what if it was people in the community who are, proposing to lead a project with other collaborators? Like, I want to work on a project with other people in the FreeCodeCamp community. Here's my idea, pitch it, other people can join it. And like, what that does is it gives people that sort of like, both that like kind of opportunity to be like leading on a project and collaborating with other people and kind of getting experience with those types of roles that you are going to be in when you're in like, the workplace. But also like for Kaggle is pretty unique and compared to something like Stack Overflow, where the practice that people are working on is always changing, whereas on Stack Overflow it's always like just keep asking more questions and keep moderating those questions and answering those questions. And I think that has led to a little bit more like ossification of who are the leaders, who is this like segment of the community that is answering the questions or moderating the questions. The moderators are, have sometimes been there for a really long time. What we get with Kaggle, because we have, constantly rotating slate of problems, is a lot more like diversity in these kind of like various like it's like a cycle, like different kind of communities each time. And so I think that has some, really nice properties in terms of what I was talking about earlier around, kind of like this us versus them dynamic that can form. And so I think could be a cool way for freeCodeCamp to take this idea with kind of project cohort based collaborative work. There you go. There's an idea.
Awesome. So thanks again for your feedback on like what we can be doing to further enhance community and move much more toward like a community of practice, because that is something I'm serious. Like I want to become a better community manager. And I'm like looking to you as kind of like a role model and a mentor in that space. Like not necessarily like hitting you up all the time, like, hey, what should I do in this situation? But like kind of a passive mentor, reading your work and like thinking, what would Meg do in this situation? What does the next year or so look like for you? I know you've got a lot of big life changes, of course, like you're immigrating to Canada. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And is that the Toronto Tower behind you in the window? Like I see that structure. It's kind of like obscured by blinds, but is that like the famous skyline element of Toronto?
Yes. Yeah, it is. Let's see. Like this is downtown Toronto, and that is the Toronto CN Tower. So yeah, and I am working on becoming Canadian. So yes, got my permanent residency a couple months ago, and eventually I'll do citizenship. But yeah. That's one thing
awesome.
That's next for me.
Yeah. What else are you focused on?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So for the next year, I mean, the big thing in my world lately, working in machine learning, of course, has been everything that's going on with large language models and generative AI. So, like, in terms of like my work at Kaggle, we're spending a lot of time thinking about how do we, make it possible for our community to learn about, all this kind of like new technology. So we are, working on more competitions that kind of bring our community and their talents and knowledge to bear on problems that, we're facing in the realm of generative AI and large language models. So that's been a thing that I expect to continue through the next year. And, it's something that we are frankly like experimenting with. A lot of like our, history in running machine learning competitions has been more traditional supervised machine learning. And so we're doing a lot of experimenting to figure out what's the scalable way to do competitions in this new paradigm. And then otherwise, like recently at Google, I've gotten involved in working on open models. So I'd say the theme of this conversation is Meg likes stuff that's open. She likes being open. She likes being transparent. Yeah. And so I've been very passionate about working on things that are kind of in the realm of open source at Google, and have been recently working on Gemma, which is Google's new family of like lightweight open language models. And I think, there's going to be a lot that the next year holds, I hope, for that front as well. But then otherwise, just having a good time in Toronto and enjoying life. So that's what's next for me.
Awesome. Well, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you, to learn more about the amazing work you're doing for the data science community through Kaggle, the open data sets you all are providing, the open models you all are creating. It's really amazing, and I'm going to encourage everybody to check the links that I've added in the show notes, so that you can follow Meg and like learn more about her adventures and see some of her pretty esoteric movie recommendations. I saw quite a few in there that I'm gonna catch up with at some point. But it's cool. You're kind of like a tastemaker in the Larson household now. So
love that.
Yeah. So thanks again for making time. I hope everybody who has listened to this has enjoyed. Has learned a little bit about what it's like to go from academia to industry, working, at Google, working with the latest and greatest technology, helping build communities, helping apply a lot of your like what it's like to apply this field that was kind of obscure, like linguistics and stuff. She's now at the forefront of like AI research and stuff. Like that's very serendipitous that like so much of what you've learned and obsessed over for so much of your life is like suddenly super duper relevant. That's really cool. So until next week, everybody, happy coding.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Quincy.